Welcome to the Explainer. So I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine a massive, heavily armed warship navigating its way right through a narrow, highly contested strait. Now ask yourself, is this vessel keeping the peace, or is it starting a war? Well, it entirely depends on who you ask, right? Today, we're unpacking one of the absolutely most fascinating and, frankly, dangerous dynamics in international relations. We're going to look at how the exact same military actions are interpreted through two totally diametrically opposed geopolitical lenses.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the shield of deterrence. Second, the sword of provocation. Then, realism and global flashpoints, freedom or encirclement, the cognitive battlefield, and finally, a precarious security dilemma. We're going to explore all these perspectives completely neutrally, relying squarely on the strategic doctrines that actually shape these worldviews.
So starting off with Section 1, the shield of deterrence, Western posture, and the rules-based order.
To really get a grip on the Western framework, we can look at documents like the Australian Defence White Paper, where military posture is fundamentally all about defensive deterrence. The big overarching goal here is maintaining a stable, rules-based global security order. So, for Western actors, military presence is framed as this necessary measure to protect sovereign rights, restrain aggression, and basically prevent major military powers from dominating critical global approaches. A prime example of this defensive posturing is something called strategic ambiguity. You've probably heard of it. It's famously used by the United States in the Taiwan Strait. Basically, it's deterrence by uncertainty. By never explicitly stating what it would actually do in the event of an attack, the U.S. purposefully restrains both sides. It keeps potential adversaries guessing, right? The goal is to deter them from launching an unprovoked attack, while at the exact same time, restraining allies from taking actions that could drag the whole region into a major confrontation. So in this framework, ambiguity is literally a tool for maintaining a super delicate security balance.
And that brings us to the absolute core focus of our explainer today. How do Western actors frame their support and positioning? Well, as defensive deterrence and upholding sovereign rights. But, and this is a big but, from the opposing view, this exact same proximity of Western military assets is seen as an intentional, aggressive escalation that's basically meant to provoke a security crisis. It's a geopolitical Rashomon, really. You have the exact same facts on the ground, but they're interpreted in completely contradictory ways depending entirely on where you sit.
Moving right along to Section 2, the sword of provocation, the existential threat of encirclement.
Let's execute a hard pivot here and look through that opposing lens for a second. To nations like Russia or China, Western military proximity doesn't look like a protective shield. It looks like a sword at their throat. They view the deployment of Western assets, alliances, and military tech near their borders not as defensive at all, but as an existential, aggressive encirclement designed to undermine their sovereignty and limit their geopolitical influence. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how international relations theory explains this exact tension perfectly, using the real-world scenario of NATO's advanced Storm Shadow missiles in Ukraine. Under offensive realism, powers are driven to expand their influence. Through this lens, NATO's deployment of advanced tech is seen as a deliberate, offensive strategy to establish Western dominance and permanently weaken Russia. But flip that to defensive realism, where states prioritize self-preservation. From this perspective, Russia's reaction to advanced NATO technology near its borders isn't about expanding its own power. It's seen as a rational, almost panicked attempt to protect its sovereignty from what it perceives as an overwhelming Western encirclement.
That brings us to Section 3, realism and global flashpoints, applying theory to conflict.
Now, these aren't just abstract academic theories. They're actually playing out in real time in the world's most dangerous waters. Let's transition from Eastern Europe over to the Pacific to see how these clashing worldviews actually collide and create the modern flashpoints dominating our news feeds today. Take freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, in the South China Sea. The United States views navigating these vital waterways as a completely non-negotiable core interest. To them, it's just a routine patrol to uphold international maritime law and make sure sea lanes remain open for global trade. However, the opposing power, China, views these exact same operations as highly provocative acts of intimidation and a really direct challenge to their territorial integrity. Again, what one side calls a standard legal patrol, the other absolutely calls a deliberate provocation.
Okay, moving to Section 4, freedom or encirclement, dueling narratives in action.
To really grasp the heat of these clashing perspectives, we've got to look back at the 1996 Taiwan missile crisis. The way both sides communicated during this very real standoff demonstrates the immense narrative tension that happens when these two worldviews collide head-on. During the crisis, China launched missile exercises near Taiwan, and the U.S. perspective? Absolute condemnation. U.S. Defense Secretary William Cohen labeled the exercises, quote, an attempt to intimidate Taiwan, an act of coercion. In the Western view, this was a completely reckless provocation threatening to destabilize the whole region, which then prompted the U.S. to send warships to the area as a show of defensive deterrence.
But, as you might guess, that Western narrative was immediately and totally rejected. In response to the U.S. sending warships, PRC Foreign Minister Chien Chen stated, Taiwan is a part of China and not a protectorate of the United States. And this brilliantly illustrates the total rejection of the Western narrative. For China, the U.S. presence was the actual provocation. They framed their own missile tests as a strictly internal matter of maintaining territorial integrity, and the U.S. naval response as this aggressive, totally unacceptable foreign interference.
Now, this deep-seated tension definitely hasn't faded over the years. It's really just evolved into the digital age. Back in 2020, a pretty remarkable exchange took place on social media. China's Global Times explicitly threatened the U.S., warning of their aircraft carrier killer missiles and stating the South China Sea was fully within their grasp. And how did the U.S. Navy respond? They defiantly posted photos of the USS Nimitz and Ronald Reagan operating in those exact waters, flat out stating they are not intimidated. It's basically a very public, rapid-fire continuation of this exact deterrence versus provocation debate, just playing out on Twitter for the whole world to see.
Which leads us to Section 5, the cognitive battlefield, winning without fighting.
Because kinetic war, actual shooting, is just incredibly costly. This geopolitical ambiguity is increasingly being weaponized below the threshold of armed conflict. Welcome to the realm of cognitive warfare, something highly utilized by powers like Russia and China to achieve their strategic goals without ever firing a single shot. So the crucial point is how ambiguity is used here. Adversaries intentionally create it, using deniable operations and mixing their signals to prepare a narrative that shapes the whole information environment. This ambiguity is specifically designed to induce decision paralysis in the target's leadership. Think about it. By the time the defending nation figures out if they're just looking at a routine exercise or a real, actual threat, the adversary has already secured their objectives.
We can see this vividly in the PLA's cognitive tactics against Taiwan. They use these multi-domain actions to constantly, relentlessly blur the lines. First, they systematically erase air defense identification zones using advanced aircraft, weather balloons, and UAVs. They launch cyber attacks. The goal isn't to start a hot war today. It's to induce deep decision fatigue among Taiwan's defenders and force this grueling war of cognitive attrition. By conditioning the population and international observers to view this constant, low-level aggression as just the new normal, they slowly reshape the entire strategic environment and redefine deterrence thresholds, literally bypassing a kinetic fight altogether.
Let's move to Section 6 and see how this all builds into a precarious security dilemma, the fragility of stability. When you mix cognitive warfare with these clashing geopolitical worldviews, the risk of a catastrophic misstep is just astronomical. And that brings us to the ultimate paradox of international relations, the security dilemma. This is a situation where actions taken by one state to enhance its own security end up provoking deep insecurity in another state. It's a vicious cycle. Western powers feel absolutely compelled to deploy assets and conduct operations to protect international rules and deter aggression. But those opposing adversaries interpret those exact defensive deployments as an existential encroachment that then forces them into what they see as preventative aggressive actions just to survive. Both sides feel they're acting defensively. Both sides view the other as the primary aggressor. It is practically a recipe for unintended, disastrous escalation.
Which leaves us with this final profound question to consider today. When the shield of defensive deterrence is perceived by your adversary as the sword of an existential threat, how do we prevent a misunderstanding from sparking the next global war? It's a massive challenge, one that rests on a razor's edge and requires some incredibly careful navigation of narratives, technology, and deeply entrenched worldviews. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and as always, keep questioning the narratives.